Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin the Orca attack story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe, click the like button, and leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Now let's move on to the case. The sea was eerily calm as Johan sat in the cockpit of his small yacht, staring out at the endless stretch of water surrounding him. It was the kind of day that made the ocean feel as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The sun was low in the sky, casting a soft golden glow over the surface of the water. Despite the quiet beauty, Johan's mind raced as he tried once again to start the engine. "Come on, damn it," Johan muttered, his fingers stiff as he worked the engine's controls. The yacht had been his pride and joy, something he'd saved for years to afford, and now with no land in sight and no way to call for help, it felt like a lifeline slowly slipping away from him. The engine sputtered, then coughed, refusing to cooperate. He cursed under his breath, slamming his fist against the dashboard. His fingers tightened around the wheel as he fought back the frustration building inside him. There had been no warning. One moment, the engine was running smoothly, and the next it had failed without explanation. He'd checked every connection, inspected every part, but nothing seemed to work. He glanced at his radio, hoping for a signal, but the screen was dead, just a blank display. The isolation of the open sea weighed down on him, a heavy feeling that crept into his chest. He was stranded, and for the first time in years of sailing, he realized just how vulnerable he was. "Why does this always happen to me?" he muttered, rubbing his face with both hands. He was alone, no crew, no other boat in sight. The weather was still on his side, but without a way to fix the engine, without a way to call for help. He was at the mercy of the sea. Johan took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He wasn't new to the sea. He'd been sailing since he was a boy, and he knew how to survive out here. This wasn't his first breakdown, and it wouldn't be his last. All he had to do was wait for help. They'd come for him, he was sure of it. It was only a matter of time. As he turned back to the engine, the soft splash of water against the hull caught his attention. Johan's head snapped up, and his eyes scanned the horizon. At first he thought he was seeing things. A trick of the light perhaps, but then he saw them clearly. A pod of orcas had appeared, cutting through the water like shadows in the deep. Their massive bodies glided effortlessly beneath the surface, and the occasional dorsal fin broke through the water as they swam in graceful synchrony. Johan couldn't help but smile. He had seen orcas before, of course, who hadn't? But it was always a special sight, especially when they were so close. His fingers instinctively reached for his camera, capturing the moment. The orcas were beautiful, their black and white bodies contrasting against the endless blue of the ocean. He zoomed in for a closer shot, silently admiring their power and grace. "They're magnificent," he whispered to himself, as if speaking to the creatures. He watched them, entranced, forgetting for a moment about the engine and the isolation of his situation. The orcas moved closer, circling the boat, and Johan felt a pang of awe. He had read about the intelligence of these creatures, their complex social structures, their ability to communicate and cooperate in ways that few animals could. He marveled at how they seemed to glide around him, their movements calculated, yet serene. As they approached, Johan began to feel a slight unease. There was no reason to be concerned, of course. Orcas were known to be curious, but they were rarely dangerous to humans. The boat was large enough to keep a safe distance, and as long as he didn't provoke them, they would likely move on soon enough. But the more Johan watched, the more unsettling it became. The pod wasn't just swimming past. No, they were circling, their dark eyes fixed on him. He had heard of orcas behaving in strange ways before, how they sometimes played with boats or appeared to be testing them. But this felt different. There was a tension in the air, something Johan couldn't quite put his finger on. He snapped another photo, his hands trembling slightly. The orcas were now so close that he could make out the distinct white markings on their bellies. Their eyes seemed to glint in the fading sunlight, cold and calculating. They were watching him, not with curiosity but with something else, something he couldn't understand. A low, eerie sound cut through the quiet. It wasn't the usual splash of water or the gentle hum of the engine. No, this sound was different. A deep, vibrating thrum that seemed to echo through the boat. Johann's pulse quickened and he turned around, scanning the deck. The yacht creaked under the pressure, and for a moment, Johann thought he felt the unmistakable sensation of something heavy bumping against the hull. His breath hitched. The orcas were not just swimming around anymore. One of them had struck the boat, slamming its massive body against the side with a force that sent a shockwave through the vessel. Johann staggered, grabbing onto the railing to steady himself. His heart raced as the yacht rocked violently, tilting slightly to one side. "Shit," he cursed, stumbling across the deck. The orcas didn't retreat. Instead, they circled even closer, their bodies cutting through the water with unnerving speed. The massive black and white fins rose and fell, like the prow of a ship, creating an unsettling rhythm as the creatures began to ram the boat again and again. Johann's mind raced. What was happening? He had heard of orcas exhibiting strange behaviors, but he had never imagined anything like this. He knew that the whales weren't just playing, they were attacking. There was no doubt in his mind now. Something about the pod had changed and he was caught in the middle of it. His heart pounded as another brutal strike sent the boat tilting further. The sound of the impact was deafening and Johann felt a sudden surge of panic. The yacht groaned under the pressure, the wood creaking and splintering. He rushed to the side, checking the hull for damage, but he didn't need to look closely to know the situation was dire. The orcas were relentless. They hit the boat with such force that Johann could hear the structure cracking, the sound of splintering wood making his blood run cold. The waves around the yacht grew choppy as the animals continued their assault, the boat lurching and swaying with every strike. "Get away!" Johann shouted, his voice trembling as he backed away from the edge. He knew it was pointless, but he couldn't help himself. He grabbed a flare gun from the storage compartment and fired it into the sky, hoping that someone, anyone, would see it and come to his rescue. But the orcas didn't stop. They circled the boat with purpose, as if they were waiting for something. Johann could feel the cold dread creeping over him, settling deep in his bones. The boat was taking on water now, slowly but steadily. His distress signal had been sent, but the orcas didn't seem to care. It was as if they had no intention of letting him go. He fired another flare, this one higher into the sky. It lit up the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the water, but even as it burned bright, Johann knew that the help he so desperately needed might not arrive in time. The orcas didn't respond to his panic. They continued their methodical, unrelenting assault, pushing the yacht closer and closer to its breaking point. Johann's hands were shaking as he grabbed the railing again, his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't let this be the end. Not like this. But as the water rose higher around him, he knew the fight for survival was only just beginning. Johann's grip on the boat's rail tightened as the orcas continued their relentless assault. The yacht groaned beneath the strain of each blow, the hull shuddering violently with every strike. His heart raced as he looked around in panic, his mind scrambling for a way to survive. The boat was tilting more with each violent strike, water slowly seeping into the lower deck. The orcas' dark forms glided through the water, their eyes never leaving him, their movements controlled and calculated. The yacht had become a prison and he was a sitting target. God, what the hell do they want? Johann muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper over the sound of the crashing waves and the pounding of the orcas' bodies against the boat. The cold, salty air whipped around him, and he could feel his breath quickening with the rising tide of panic. His eyes darted to the horizon, searching for any sign of rescue, but there was nothing. Just endless ocean and a sky growing darker by the minute. Another crash against the hull threw him to the ground. He scrambled to his feet, his pulse racing. The boat's stern dipped further and water lapped at his ankles as he moved toward the back of the yacht, trying to keep his balance. The orcas were circling closer now, no longer just striking and retreating but moving with an eerie precision, their dorsal fins breaking the surface of the water like knives. "Shit," Johann whispered, his hands slick with sweat as he reached for the emergency radio. The screen remained dead, the lack of a signal mocking his attempts. He pulled the antenna out of its compartment and twisted it desperately, hoping for a miracle, but the radio remained silent. The orcas were getting closer, and there was no way out. He was alone. His thoughts raced as he paced back and forth, trying to formulate a plan. He knew the orcas didn't attack humans by nature, but he also knew that their intelligence and hunting strategies were unparalleled. If they saw him as a threat, or worse, as prey, there was no way he could fend them off. His mind flickered to the flare gun still in his hand, but he knew it wouldn't help. It was too late for that. Johann's eyes moved back to the orcas. They were moving slowly now, as though sizing him up, the quiet grace of their movements almost more terrifying than their violent strikes. The boat creaked again, and a sharp crack followed. A large section of the hull had been damaged. The water was rising quickly now, the yacht tilting dangerously to one side. Come on, Johann muttered, his voice strained as he checked the engine again, though he knew it was a futile effort. It was flooded now. There was no hope of getting the motor to start. He was stranded. Without warning, the largest of the orcas broke the surface with a force that rocked the yacht. The sound was deafening, like a crash of thunder. Johann was thrown to the ground once more, his body slamming against the deck. Pain shot through his shoulder, but he barely noticed. He scrambled too. His feet and panic seized his chest when he realized that the water was rising faster now. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. With shaking hands, Johann grabbed his life jacket and yanked it over his head. He didn't hesitate. He couldn't afford to. He moved toward the side of the boat, glancing back at the orcas. They had not retreated. They were still circling, watching, waiting. His stomach churned with dread. Is this it? He asked himself, his voice trembling. He stepped to the edge of the boat, looking down into the dark water below. His heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct told him to jump, to swim to safety. But the orcas were there. He could see their massive bodies moving just beneath the surface, their sharp, predatory eyes locked onto him. Johann hesitated for a fraction of a second, but that was all it took for the situation to go from bad to worse. A sudden, bone-jarring impact sent him sprawling on the deck, his head slamming against the railing. Dazed, he looked up just in time to see the orca, its enormous body breaking through the water in a violent surge. The yacht groaned, tilting even further. The orca wasn't just bumping into the boat now, it was ramming it, intentionally and forcefully. Johann's vision blurred with panic and he stumbled backward, his legs weak. His body was telling him to jump, but the icy grip of fear held him in place. Another strike, and the boat rocked perilously. The front of the yacht was already submerged and the stern was rising up, nearly vertical. He could hear the wood cracking, splintering under the pressure. In a split second, Johann's body acted before his mind could catch up. He leaped off the side of the boat, diving into the water. The cold hit him like a shock, a jolt that made his heart race even faster. He could barely see, the water clouded and churning as he kicked his legs to the surface. When he broke through, gasping for air, he spun around, his eyes frantically searching the water for the orcas. They had vanished. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of the waves and his own ragged breathing. For a moment, Johann dared to hope. Maybe they had lost interest. But that hope shattered as he felt a sudden shift in the water. Beneath him, he froze, his breath caught in his throat. The surface of the ocean rippled around him, and then, like a dark shadow moving beneath the water, the orcas reappeared. They were no longer circling the boat. They were coming for him. Johann's heart pounded in his chest as the first orca emerged from the depths, its sleek black and white form cutting through the water with terrifying speed. Its eyes were locked on him, unblinking and cold. He could feel the predator's gaze as it moved closer, and he knew without a doubt that it was hunting him. "Please, God," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the waves. He kicked harder, his muscles screaming in protest, trying to swim away from the approaching threat. The cold water seared his skin, but the fear was sharper. He glanced over his shoulder and saw another orca breaking the surface, then another. There were more of them than he had realized. They were surrounding him. Panic surged through Johann's body, his legs flailing as he tried to escape. The water felt like a trap closing in on him from every side. He was not a swimmer in open water. He had always relied on his yacht to keep him safe, but now the sea was a predator, and he was its prey. The first orca made its move, darting toward him in a flash. Johann instinctively dived underwater, but it was too late. He felt the immense force of the orca's body beneath him, like a giant wave crashing over him. He kicked and flailed, desperately, trying to break free, but the orca was too strong. It was playing with him now, toying with him, keeping him within its reach. Johan's heart raced as he broke the surface again, gasping for air. The orcas were closing in. The water churned around him, and he could feel the pressure mounting as the pod of orcas circled, their movements controlled and deliberate. Johan's body was growing numb from the cold, his energy sapping with each frantic stroke. He had no strength left, no way to fight back. The pod was relentless, and the water around him felt like a tomb, closing in tighter with every passing second. A flare gun. The thought flickered in his mind, and he reached for it with shaking hands, but even as he pulled it out, he knew it was pointless. The orcas had him trapped. They were closing in for the kill. Then, just as Johan's mind began to go numb with fear, he saw something on the horizon. A boat, small but coming toward him. His hope flared briefly before he realized just how far away it was, too far for him to reach in his condition. The orcas began to retreat slowly, almost reluctantly, as if they had finished their game. Johan could barely keep his eyes open now. His body was shutting down, the cold sinking deeper into his bones. The last thing he saw before slipping into unconsciousness was the pod disappearing into the depths, their dark silhouettes fading from view. The ocean swallowed him whole. Johan's body felt like dead weight as he floated, barely conscious, in the cold sea. His limbs ached, his vision blurred, and his chest tightened with every shallow breath. The orcas had vanished beneath the waves, but their presence still lingered in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't shake. The memory of their eyes, cold and unyielding, haunted him even as he fought to stay afloat. His head spun with dizziness and his heart hammered in his chest. The water around him was still, but his thoughts were chaotic. He could barely feel his fingers anymore, the cold numbing his extremities with each passing second. Every wave felt like it might be the last, and each breath felt harder to take. In the distance, Johan could just make out the shape of the rescue boat, a small speck on the horizon. It seemed impossibly far, but it was there, and it was his only hope. He could hear the faint sound of engines in the distance, but the waves distorted the sound, making it seem like the boat was getting further away rather than closer. His muscles burned with exhaustion, but he forced himself to keep swimming. The orcas were gone, but the fear still gripped him. He could almost hear the sound of their deep, eerie clicks in his ears, the vibrations of their bodies cutting through the water. The cold was suffocating him, but it was the terror that truly threatened to drown him. He didn't know how much longer he could last. Keep going, Johan muttered to himself through chattering teeth, his voice barely audible over the water. Just keep going. His arms and legs were leaden, each stroke feeling heavier than the last. He knew he couldn't stop. He couldn't afford to. The boat was still far off, and he had no idea how much time he had left before the sea would claim him. His body was telling him to stop, but his mind refused to listen. Every muscle screamed in protest, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. Another surge of panic rose in his chest when he looked over his shoulder and saw a shadow moving beneath the surface. His heart skipped a beat and he froze. The water around him rippled as something massive glided just beneath the surface. Johan's eyes widened in terror, his throat tightening with fear. No, not again, he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. The shadow vanished, and Johan's breath hitched in his throat. His mind raced. Images of the orcas crashing into the boat, circling him in the water, filled his thoughts. He couldn't go through that again. He had to get to the boat. He had to survive. With a desperate cry, Johan kicked harder, his body protesting every movement. His arms were heavy, his legs like concrete, but he forced himself to swim, pushing through the pain and fear. His vision blurred as tears mixed with seawater, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The boat was closer now, but still too far. His energy was running out, and the cold seemed to seep deeper into his bones with each passing second. His breaths were ragged, each one harder to take than the last. His head felt heavy and his body trembled uncontrollably. He glanced over his shoulder once more. No shadow, no orca. But the silence was deafening. It was almost worse than the fear of the predators. The absence of the orcas meant nothing. It didn't mean they were gone. It only meant they were waiting. watching from below. "Just a little further," he whispered to himself, his voice shaky. Just a little further. His arms felt like they were about to give out, and his body seemed to be sinking with every stroke. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't let the ocean take him, not like this. Not after everything he had been through. A sudden surge of pain in his leg made him gasp. He kicked violently, trying to shake it off, but the pain only grew sharper. Something was in the water with him. His mind screamed at him to look, but his body refused to obey. He kicked harder, swimming with whatever strength he had left. His leg screamed in agony, but he couldn't let it stop him. The pain was excruciating, but it was the terror that froze him. He knew something was moving under the water, something big, something hunting him. "No!" he yelled, his voice raw with fear. "Please, no more!" The shadow beneath him grew larger, and Johann's heart nearly stopped. He could hear the sound of the water moving, the deep, rumbling hum of something massive swimming below. His eyes frantically scanned the surface, but there was nothing. Nothing but the empty expanse of the sea. The boat was so close now. He could almost hear the crew calling to him, could almost see their hands reaching for him. But the water was too cold, too unforgiving. His muscles burned and his vision was going dark. His leg gave out, the pain shooting through his body like a bolt of lightning. Johann screamed, his body sinking beneath the surface. Panic flooded his veins as the water closed over him, swallowing him whole. He was going under. He was going to drown. No, he couldn't. He wouldn't. With everything he had left, Johann kicked upward, his body protesting every movement. His lungs burned, his heart hammered in his chest. He broke through the surface with a desperate gasp, but the boat was still too far. "Help! Help!" he screamed, but his voice was weak, barely audible above the water. The shadow below him moved again, a dark shape rising from the depths. Johann's eyes widened in terror. He had no strength left. He couldn't fight. He could barely stay afloat. A deep rumbling sound echoed through the water. The orcas, they were back. Johann's breath came in short, desperate gasps as he turned his head, searching frantically for the creatures. But there was no sign of them. The water was still. The silence was suffocating. It felt like the calm before the storm. But the storm was coming, and Johann was in its path. The boat was close now. So close. He could see the figures on board, their faces peering over the edge, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. He raised his arm weakly, trying to signal them, but the pain in his leg was unbearable. His strength was gone. The sea was pulling him under, and he couldn't fight it anymore. "Help!" he managed to croak, but the words were drowned out by the water. His head slipped beneath the surface again, and his vision swam with darkness. The last thing he saw was the silhouette of the boat, the figures on board reaching toward him. And then the ocean swallowed him whole, pulling him deeper into its depths. Johann woke with a start, his body jerking as he gasped for air. His heart was racing, his body covered in sweat. But when he opened his eyes, he saw only darkness. The weight of the water had been replaced by the weight of reality. He was still alive. He had been rescued. He didn't know how long he had been unconscious, but the nightmare still gripped him. The orcas, the cold, the pain. They were all still there, swirling in his mind like a storm he couldn't outrun. His body was bruised and battered, but he had survived. But the terror wasn't over. The fear still lingered in the back of his mind, waiting to rise again. "You're safe," a voice said, soft but firm, pulling him from his thoughts. Johann turned his head and saw a figure standing over him, one of the rescuers, their face blurred by the dim light. "You're going to be okay," they said. But Johann knew. It wasn't over. It never would be. The ocean had taken something from him, something he would never get back. The memory of the orcas would haunt him forever. The darkness of the ocean seemed to press in around Johann, a suffocating weight that never lifted, even as he drifted in and out of consciousness. His body was numb, but his mind was alive with a relentless buzz of anxiety. Memories of the attack replaying in vivid flashes. The faint hum of the rescue boat's engine had been his salvation, but it hadn't been enough to quell the deep dread that clung to him like the salt water on his skin. Johann sat up in the cramped, dimly lit cabin, the creak of the boat's wood and the constant slap of water against the hull, reminding him that he was still adrift, still in the ocean. The rescue crew had insisted on immediate medical attention, but his injuries, while painful, weren't as severe as the terror that gripped his mind. His head was wrapped in a thick bandage and his shoulder throbbed from where he'd struck the railing during the first violent collision with the Orca. But that wasn't what consumed him. What consumed him were the images of those massive creatures, circling him, their eyes like cold, calculating predators. Waiting. "How you holding up?" A voice broke through his thoughts, and Johann looked up to see the grizzled face of one of the rescue crew. He didn't recognize the man's name, but his face was a permanent fixture on the boat, a silent, watchful presence. Johann didn't answer at first. Instead, he stared at the man, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the table in front of him. I don't know," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "I thought they were gone. I thought I was done for when they disappeared under the water, but then they came back. They just kept circling me. I didn't know what to do." The crewman nodded, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I've seen orcas before. Never like that, though. You're lucky you're alive." Johann swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had heard of orcas, hunting in packs, but the idea of them targeting a human had always seemed impossible, something out of a thriller novel. Yet here he was, the sole survivor of an encounter that was far too real. "I thought it was just a freak thing," Johann continued, shaking his head as though the motion would shake the fear from his mind. "A once-in-a-lifetime kind of attack. But then I heard the clicks, felt them under me like they were playing with me, testing me." He clenched his fists, the fear still clawing at his chest. "They were toying with me. I could feel them, like they were waiting for the right moment to strike." The crewman stayed silent for a long moment before speaking again, his voice low. "That's exactly what they do. They're predators, Johann. They know when to strike, when to wait. They'll push their prey to the brink until the animal is too weak to fight back." Johann's eyes glazed over as the words settled, in dredging up a memory that he hadn't yet faced, the moment when he'd been submerged beneath the water, his breath coming in ragged gasps and the sensation of the orca's massive body gliding beneath him, almost as if it were enjoying the chase. Johann had known in that moment that the orca wasn't just hunting, it was savoring the fear. "I never should have been out there," Johann muttered, more to himself than to the crewman. "I should have just stayed in port. I shouldn't have pushed it." "You can't blame yourself for nature, Johann," the crewman replied, his tone soft but firm. "You did what you could. You survived. That's more than most could say." But Johann couldn't shake the feeling of guilt gnawing at him. The thought that if he had done something differently, if he had seen the signs sooner, if he had somehow avoided the orcas, maybe he wouldn't be here now, broken and shaken to his core. He pushed the thought aside, forcing himself to focus. "Where's the rest of the crew?" he asked, his voice a little stronger now. He needed something, anything, to distract him from the darkness in his mind. "They're still scanning the area," the crewman said, his eyes flicking to the radar screen on the console. "We'll keep searching for your boat until we know it's not coming up. But right now all we're doing is making sure you're all right. We've got to get you back to the mainland before the storm hits." The words barely registered in Johann's mind. The storm. That was the least of his worries right now. It was the quiet that frightened him. The moments when he was left alone with nothing but his own thoughts. The more time he spent on this boat, the more he felt like the ocean was trying to swallow him whole. He was no longer just afraid of what had happened. He was terrified of the possibility that it would happen again. The crewman left Johann alone in the cabin, but Johann didn't know how to be alone anymore. He wanted to sleep, but every time his eyes closed, the orcas were there. He could feel their presence in the dark corners of his mind, their clicks echoing in his skull. He couldn't escape them. The fear was all-consuming. Without thinking, Johann staggered to his feet and stumbled outside onto the deck. The night air hit him with a biting cold, but it was a welcome sensation. He could hear the distant rumble of thunder from the storm that was starting to gather on the horizon, but it was the silence of the sea that unsettled him the most. The water stretched endlessly around the boat, flat and dark, with no sign of life except for the occasional bird that flew overhead. The crew had kept their distance, giving him space to recover. But now, standing alone in the middle of the vast ocean, Johann felt like he was losing his grip. It wasn't just the physical trauma. It was the terror that had settled into his bones, the knowledge that he had been a mere plaything for creatures that had no reason to show mercy. He had been at their mercy, and they had left him alive only to face the mental scars that would never heal. Johann looked out at the water, but the sight only made him feel smaller. The orcas had been so much larger than he'd ever imagined, their black and white bodies so graceful and deadly. He couldn't help but wonder if they had let him go because they were bored, or if it had simply been a game to them, something to pass the time before they moved on to easier prey. "Johann?" The voice came from behind him, and he turned to see the same crewman standing on the deck, a look of concern on his face. "You need to rest, the storm's coming in faster than we thought." Johann nodded, though he had no intention of sleeping. The idea of being enclosed in the cabin, alone with his thoughts, was unbearable. But he couldn't stay out on the deck forever, not with the storm approaching. He could feel the tension building in his chest as the sky darkened, the wind picking up in a sudden gust. The crewman moved to the wheel, preparing the boat for the incoming storm. Johann watched him work for a moment, the crewman's movements swift and practiced. Johann wished he could focus on something as simple as steering a boat, but his mind was a storm of its own. A crack of lightning split the sky, followed by a deep rumbling thunder. The crewman muttered something under his breath as he tightened the sails, securing the boat against the rising winds. "Hey," Johann said, his voice barely audible above the storm. Do you think they're still out there?" The crewman paused for a moment, his back to Johann before turning around. His face was shadowed by the storm, but there was something in his eyes that made Johann's stomach tighten. "I don't know," the crewman said, his voice serious. "But if they are, you don't need to worry about them. You're safe now." Johann didn't believe him. Not completely. Safe? He didn't know what that meant anymore. Not after what he had faced out there in the open water. The sea had turned on him, and he wasn't sure he'd ever feel safe again. But as the storm began to rage around them, Johann didn't argue. The crewman was right about one thing. He was alive. And for now, that would have to be enough. The days after the attack blurred together in a haze of confusion and exhaustion. Johann was alive, yes, but the terror of what had happened on the open sea still gripped him, making every moment feel like a slow unraveling of his sanity. His body healed, bruises fading, cuts closing, but the trauma that lingered beneath his skin felt like a wound that would never heal. They had taken him back to the mainland, but he hardly remembered the journey. The rescue crew had been kind, if distant, and the crewman who had spoken to him that night had made sure he was taken to a hospital once they docked. But the hospital felt cold and sterile, the smell of antiseptic too strong and the doctors' voices too muffled for Johann to trust. His mind had returned to the sea, to the orcas, to the sounds of their clicking and the thundering crashes that had filled his ears. Johann spent most of the next few days in the small rented apartment near the hospital, staring out the window at the busy street below. The world had continued without him, but he hadn't been able to move forward. Not yet. Every sound on the wind, every creak of the floorboards beneath his feet made his heart skip in his chest. The fear was relentless, always on the edge of his consciousness, waiting for the moment to seize him again. The nightmares were the worst part. They were vivid, too real, filled with the oppressive darkness of the ocean and the cold, calculating eyes of the orcas. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, his body trembling, his heart racing as if he were still in the water, still being hunted. There was no escape from them. Not in his dreams, not in his waking hours. It felt like they were always with him, waiting. One night, after another long and fitful sleep, Johann sat up in bed, staring at the clock. It was nearly 2 a.m, and he hadn't slept properly in days. He could hear the distant hum of traffic outside, the soft sounds of the city that he once found comforting, but now felt distant, foreign. He was losing himself to the memory of the attack, and he knew he couldn't keep going like this. But the question was, what could he do? How could he escape the grip the orcas had on his mind? A soft knock at the door startled him, and for a moment he wondered if he had imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. "Johann?" A voice called from the other side, familiar yet distant. He stood, almost in a daze, and walked to the door. When he opened it, he found the rescue crewman standing there looking weary but concerned. His weathered face was softer than Johann remembered, but there was no mistaking the quiet intensity in his eyes. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," the crewman said, "but I thought you could use some company. Mind if I come in?" Johann hesitated, for a moment, unsure if he was ready for a conversation that would pull him further away from the world he had locked himself in. But he stepped aside, nodding silently. "Come in." The crewman entered, glancing around the small apartment before his gaze fell back on Johann. "How are you holding up?" Johann didn't know how to answer. The question felt too broad, too loaded. What did it even mean to be holding up after something like that? How was anyone supposed to hold up after staring death in the face, after being the prey in a predator's game? He looked at the floor, his fingers clenching at his sides. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. I'm still here, but it doesn't feel like I'm really alive, you know?" The crewman nodded, his expression unreadable but sympathetic. "Yeah, I get it. It's like you're not the same person you were before. Not in the way people expect. And it's not something you can just talk away or shake off." Johann sank into the couch, his body heavy with the weight of the last few days. "I can't stop seeing it, you know? The orcas. I can still feel them circling me. And the water. It's like it's still inside me. Like I'm still drowning." "You're not drowning anymore," the crewman said gently, sitting down across from him. "You're here. You made it through, and you're gonna make it through this too." Johann shook his head, his chest tightening. "I don't know. Every time I close my eyes, I see them, I hear them, I know it's real. I wasn't imagining it. But it's like I'm still in the water. I can't get out. I don't know how to move on from this." The crewman looked at him for a long time, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Finally he spoke, his voice low but firm. "You need to talk about it. Not just with me. You need to face it. The orcas, the fear. It won't go away on its own. You can't lock it up inside you. It'll eat you alive if you try." Johann felt the lump form in his throat, the tears he had been holding back threatening to spill over. "I don't know if I can," he admitted. "I don't know how." "Maybe it's not about how," the crewman replied. "Maybe it's just about doing it anyway." Johann exhaled shakily, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions that had been tearing through him since the attack. He hadn't spoken about what had happened to anyone, not in detail. He had never told anyone how the orcas had circled him, how they had moved with such precision, such a terrifying calm. It had felt like a game to them. He had felt like a toy in their hands, their plaything before they decided when, if, they would kill him, and he had no idea why they had let him live. But those thoughts, those memories had been festering inside him, clawing at his insides, threatening to drown him again. "I'm scared," Johann whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I don't know if I can let it go. I don't know how to stop being scared." The crewman reached across the small coffee table between them and placed a hand on his. "You don't have to stop being scared. But you do have to face it. You're not alone in this, Johann. You don't have to carry it all by yourself." Johann stared at the crewman's hand on his, the warmth of it grounding him for a moment. He had been so alone since the attack, so isolated, so convinced that no one could possibly understand the horror of what he had been through. But now, as he looked into the crewman's eyes, he saw something that made the smallest flicker of hope stir within him. Maybe he could talk about it. Maybe he didn't have to carry it alone. "You're right," Johann said quietly, his voice raw. "I don't know if I'll ever stop feeling the fear, but maybe I can start letting it go, bit by bit." The crewman gave him a small, reassuring smile. "One step at a time, Johann. That's all any of us can do, one step at a time." And for the first time since the attack, Johann felt something shift within him. The weight of it, the memories, the fear, the doubt was still there, but it wasn't quite as suffocating. He wasn't ready to face everything all at once, but he was beginning to realize that he didn't have to. One step at a time was all he needed. The orcas had taken something from him, something he wasn't sure he would ever fully get back. But he was still alive, and that meant there was still time. Time to heal, time to find his way back to the surface. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to move forward. The weeks after Johann's return to land were a blur of doctor's appointments, mandatory therapy sessions, and well-meaning friends and family who tried to console him, but none of it seemed to help. His body had healed, scars on his skin, fading into nothing more than pale reminders of the trauma he had endured. But his mind was a different story. The anxiety had become a constant presence, lingering just behind his eyes, making every day feel like a battle. He tried to move forward, but it was as though he was trapped in the past, constantly reliving the attack, the memory of those predatory orcas stalking him beneath the water. The nights were the worst. He would wake, gasping for air, his heart racing as though the orcas had returned to the water, circling, waiting. He would close his eyes, trying to push the images away, but they were there, always there. The clicks of their sonar, the sharp slap of their tails against the water, the cold eyes fixed on him as if to say, "We'll come for you again, when we're ready." He had stopped going to the therapy sessions. The words the therapists spoke, the advice they offered, never seemed to make a difference. He didn't know what he wanted from them. He didn't want to talk about the orcas. He didn't want to relive it. But it was always with him, always there, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts, demanding his attention. It had been a few days since he last saw the rescue crewman, the man who had pulled him from the water. And though they'd exchanged a few texts, Johann hadn't wanted to see anyone. He didn't want to talk about what had happened. Not yet. The night had settled in with a thick, oppressive quiet, the kind that made Johann's skin crawl. He was alone in his small apartment, staring out the window at the dim city lights. The streets were busy as they always were, but the sounds felt far away, like he was separated from the rest of the world by an invisible barrier. His fingers drummed on the edge of the coffee table, restless, anxious, and his mind kept circling back to the same thought. What now? His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from the crewman. "I know you're probably not ready, but I thought you might want to talk. We could meet for a coffee, whenever you're ready." Johann stared at the screen, the words jumping out at him. He could feel the weight of the past few weeks pressing on him. The isolation, the endless nights, the fear. He wasn't sure he was ready for this. He wasn't sure he was ready to face it, to face him and everything that had happened. But maybe he needed to. Maybe it was the only way he would ever stop feeling like he was drowning. He exhaled shakily, his fingers hovering over the phone before he finally typed a response. "Okay, I'll meet you tomorrow. Let's say 10 a.m.? He hit send before he could change his mind. He sat back, staring at the phone, willing himself to calm down. It had been so long since he had seen another person, truly seen them, connected with them. The thought of being around someone again, especially someone who knew what he had been through, felt like a foreign concept. But it was a step, he told himself, a step towards something, maybe even healing. The next morning, Johann found himself at a small cafe near the waterfront, the salty breeze from the harbor mixing with the faint scent of coffee beans. He had arrived early, a habit he had formed while waiting out the storm on his yacht, always scanning the horizon, always waiting for something to change. This time, however, the world felt smaller, more suffocating. He looked down at his hands, trying to calm the trembling that had taken root in his fingertips. At exactly 10 a.m., the door to the cafe opened, and the crewman walked in, looking much the same as he had when Johann had last seen him. Tough, weathered, with a quiet energy that seemed to settle the space around him. But there was something in his eyes that told Johann that even he, the stoic rescuer, had been affected by the events. The crewman's usual reserve was softened by something deeper, more fragile. Johann stood up as the man approached, and they shook hands briefly, awkwardly. Neither of them knew what to say at first. "You look like hell," the crewman said after a beat, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks," Johann replied dryly, his voice sounding harsher than he intended. He didn't mean to sound bitter. He didn't want to sound bitter. It was just that nothing felt like it fit anymore, not even his own words. They sat down at the table, the moment stretching between them like an unspoken truce. The crewman ordered coffee, and Johann followed suit, though he could feel the heat of the mug radiating into his palms as if the warmth could somehow comfort him. "So how have you been?" the crewman asked after a long silence. The words were simple, but they hung in the air with an unspoken weight, a question that asked more than just how Johann was feeling physically. Johann sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been trying to figure it out. The days are just blending together. I wake up and it feels like the attack happened yesterday, but then I realize it's been weeks." The crewman nodded, his gaze steady. "Time doesn't heal everything. You've got to let it come to you even if it's slow. You're not going to wake up one day and feel fine, but it gets better, it has to." "I don't know if I believe that," Johann muttered, staring into his coffee cup. "It's not just the memories. It's the fear, you know? It's being aware of how close I came. I think about those orcas and it's like they're still out there, like they're still waiting, and I'm just waiting for the next attack." The crewman didn't interrupt, letting Johann speak his mind, even as his words grew more frantic. The cafe was quiet, but Johann could hear the pulse of his own voice in the silence. "They didn't leave me because I got away. They left because they got bored or lost interest or I don't know. But they're out there. They're out there." Johann's voice cracked, and he felt the rawness of the words seep through his chest like liquid fire. "I don't know how to live like this with the ocean always hanging over me. I don't know how to move on, or if I even want to move on." The crewman leaned back in his chair, his hands folding in front of him as he studied Johann. "What do you think they were trying to teach you?" he asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. "The orcas, I mean." Johann blinked, the question throwing him off balance. He hadn't thought about it in those terms before. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," the crewman continued. "Maybe they weren't just attacking you. Maybe they were showing you something. Something about how small we really are out here in the wild." Johann shook his head, the idea foreign to him. "What? Like they were teaching me some kind of lesson?" "You don't get it. They were hunting me. It wasn't a game. It wasn't some lesson. It was real. And they could have killed me. They could have, and they didn't," the crewman interjected quietly, his eyes steady. "They didn't. You survived. Maybe that's the point." The words hit Johann like a slap to the face. His mouth went dry and he leaned back in his chair, feeling suddenly tired. He had never considered it that way, had never allowed himself to think about the fact that he had survived. He hadn't looked at it as a victory. He had only seen it as an escape, a lucky break. The crewman continued. "The sea, the orcas, they're not just enemies. They're part of something bigger, something wild, and we're just a small piece of it. But you're still here. You didn't let them win, and that's something." Johann stared at the table, trying to digest the crewman's words. The bitterness that had taken root in his chest seemed to loosen, just a little. Maybe there was something to be learned from the experience. Maybe it wasn't just about the terror. Maybe it was about the fact that he was still here, still fighting, still breathing. And for once, that thought didn't feel like an insurmountable weight. "I'm not okay," Johann said softly, looking up at the crewman, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't think I'll ever be okay, but I'm still here, and maybe that's something." The crewman smiled then, a genuine, small smile that softened his features. "Yeah," he said. "It's something. You're not alone, Johann. And you don't have to do it all at once. One step at a time, remember?" Johann nodded slowly, a small, tentative smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was a crack in the wall he had built around himself. And for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could begin to move forward. The morning air was crisp and Johann stood at the edge of the dock, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sky was a pale blue, tinged with the first light of dawn, and the sea stretched out before him, vast and endless. He hadn't been back to the water since the day of the attack, the memory of the orcas still fresh in his mind. He hadn't wanted to return. Couldn't, even if he'd tried. The fear had been too much. too suffocating. But today was different. Today, he was here. He'd received a message from the crewman, the same one who had pulled him from the water. "Meet me at the dock. I've got something to show you. It'll help." Johann didn't know what to expect, but something about the man's words made him want to see what he had in mind. The crewman hadn't let up, despite Johann's reluctance. He had insisted over and over that facing his fears was the only way to overcome them. And now, standing on the dock, Johann wondered if he was making a mistake by agreeing to this. He shifted from one foot to the other, feeling the cold beneath his boots as he waited. The sound of seagulls filled the air, and the gentle lap of the waves against the dock created a sense of calm, but beneath it all, Johann could feel the dread rising in his chest. He wasn't ready to face the water again. Not yet. But he had to. He knew it. He heard the faint hum of an engine in the distance, and then the sound grew louder. A small boat appeared around the bend, moving toward the dock. It was the crewman's boat. Johann's heart quickened, and he took a deep breath. He could do this. It wasn't just about the boat. It wasn't just about the water. It was about what lay beneath the surface, what had nearly killed him. And today, he was going to face it. The boat slowed as it approached the dock, and the crewman pulled it alongside with expert precision. He stood at the helm, his face shaded by a worn cap, but his eyes were steady, focused. Johann felt a surge of gratitude for the man. He had been a constant presence in the weeks following the attack, always checking in, always encouraging him to push through the fear. The boat came to a stop, and the crewman tossed a line to secure it. He turned toward Johann, offering a small, knowing smile. "You ready?" the crewman asked, his voice calm but with a hint of something unspoken. Something that suggested he knew this moment wasn't easy for Johann. Johann swallowed hard, his throat dry. He nodded even though his stomach was in knots. "I'm ready," he said, though the words didn't feel like they belonged to him. It felt like he was forcing them out, pushing through the anxiety that churned in his gut. The crewman gave him a reassuring nod and extended a hand. Johann hesitated for just a moment, but then he stepped forward, grasping the man's hand firmly. The grip was strong, steady. It grounded him, just like the crewman always did. Together they climbed into the boat. Johann settled into the passenger seat, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the sides of the boat. The crewman started the engine, and the boat lurched forward, cutting through the water with a low hum. Johann stared ahead, his heart pounding. He could feel the weight of the water beneath him, its vastness pressing in on all sides. The fear was back, lurking at the edges of his thoughts, but he forced himself to focus on the boat's steady movement. He wouldn't let the water take control of him again. As the boat drifted farther from the dock, the land faded into the distance, and the sea stretched out before them like an endless expanse. Johann's chest tightened, and his eyes darted over the surface of the water. He couldn't stop looking, couldn't stop fearing what might be lurking beneath. "You're doing good," the crewman said, breaking the silence. "Just keep breathing. Take it slow." Johann nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed the man's words. But he didn't want to seem weak. He didn't want to be the man who couldn't handle this. He wasn't that person. Not anymore. The boat continued to glide over the water, cutting through the waves with ease. Johann's eyes shifted to the horizon, searching for anything to focus on other than the water around him. He wanted to ask the crewmen why they were out here, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. The words felt like they were stuck in his throat. The crewman seemed to sense his unease. "I know what you're thinking," he said, his voice steady. "But you need to understand something. The sea, the Orcas, they're part of this world. They're not the enemy. The fear, that's what you need to face, not them." Johann turned toward the crewman, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean they're not the enemy? They tried to kill me." The crewman didn't look at him, instead keeping his eyes fixed on the water. "They didn't try to kill you, Johann. They were testing you, just like they test every creature in the sea. They pushed you to your limits, but they didn't finish the job. You survived." Johann clenched his jaw, anger bubbling up inside him. "That's easy for you to say. You didn't see them, feel them closing in on you. You didn't feel the terror of knowing you were just a moment away from being dragged under, to never see the surface again. The crewman's expression softened and he looked at Johann, his eyes steady but filled with understanding. I don't pretend to know what you felt out there, Johann. But I know this. You're not meant to live in fear of the sea, or of what's beneath it. The orcas, they're not the ones you need to fear. It's the fear itself that will destroy you if you let it. Johann's heart pounded in his chest as he listened to the crewman's words. Was it true? Was he living in fear of something that had already passed? Something he couldn't control anymore? Was his real enemy the fear, the anxiety that had gripped him since that day on the water? They continued to drift farther from the shore, the boat cutting through the water with ease. Johann felt his hands begin to loosen their grip on the sides of the boat, his muscles slowly relaxing. The tension in his chest began to ease just a little, though the gnawing fear still lingered. It wasn't gone, not by a long shot, but it wasn't suffocating him either. Not yet. The crewman steered the boat in a wide arc, bringing them into a quiet inlet. The water here was calm, the waves gentle, and the air was thick with the scent of salt and seaweed. Johann could hear the soft lapping of the water against the boat's hull, and for a moment, everything felt still. The crewman killed the engine, and the boat drifted gently, rocking with the rhythm of the water. Silence stretched between them for a long moment before the crewman spoke again. We're here, he said. I want you to look at the water. Not with fear, but with understanding. These waters, this world, and it's not your enemy, it's your ally. The orcas, they were part of that world, and they showed you something. Now, it's time to understand. Johann didn't speak at first. He just sat there staring out at the water, his mind racing with the crewman's words. The sea had always been something he had feared, something that held danger and uncertainty. But now, sitting here with the quiet waters stretching before him, Johann realized that maybe the fear wasn't something he needed to avoid. Maybe it was something he needed to understand. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the world in his chest. The fear still lingered, but it wasn't as sharp as it had been before. It wasn't as consuming. Maybe he didn't need to fight it. Maybe he just needed to let it wash over him, to let it be part of who he was without letting it control him. The crewman turned the engine back on and the boat slowly began to drift toward the shore. The journey wasn't over, Johann knew. It wouldn't be over for a long time. But maybe, just maybe, he could start living with the water, with the fear, instead of letting it control him. As the boat neared the dock, Johann felt a sense of calm settle over him, a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. And for the first time since the attack, he felt like he might just be able to move forward. Johann walked along the narrow path that led down to the beach, the weight of the morning sun heavy on his shoulders. The air was warm and salty, and the rhythmic crash of the waves against the shore seemed oddly comforting. He had been walking for what felt like hours, his feet crunching against the gravel, but his mind was elsewhere, drifting back to the boat trip with the crewman and the words that had followed. You're not meant to live in fear of the sea. That sentence had stuck with him, echoing in his mind like a mantra. Every step he took toward the water seemed to carry more weight, and every breath he drew was heavier than the last. He hadn't gone back to the sea, not in any real way since that day when the orcas had surrounded him, but today, something had changed. Maybe it was the crewman's words, or maybe it was the silence that had followed. But something had shifted. He stopped at the edge of the water, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sea was calm today, almost serene, and the surface of the water glistened under the sunlight. A slight breeze ruffled his hair, and for a moment, Johann just stood there, breathing in the salty air. He felt the coolness of the sand beneath his feet, grounding him even as his mind wandered back to the days that had led up to this moment. It hadn't been easy. None of it had been easy. The attack, the isolation, the constant fear. He had tried to move on, to ignore the pull the sea had on him, but it was always there, just beneath the surface. Now, standing here, so close to the water that he could feel the mist rising from the waves, Johann realized that he couldn't run from it anymore. He couldn't keep pretending that the fear wasn't real. He had to face it, and he had to do it alone. Hey, The voice broke through his thoughts, and Johann turned to see the crewman walking toward him, his figure outlined by the sun. Johann hadn't expected him to be here, not today, but he was grateful for the company. The crewman had become something of a guide for him in these past few weeks, always there, always steady when Johann needed him most. "I didn't expect to see you here," Johann said, his voice rough from the weight of his own thoughts. "I thought you were busy with your boat, or whatever it is you do when you're not saving people from orcas." The crewman chuckled, his grin wide and easy. "I had a little time today. Figured I'd check in on you. How you holding up?" Johann shrugged, trying to ignore the lump that had formed in his throat. "Better," he said after a long pause. "I guess. I'm still figuring it out, you know? The whole living with it thing." "Yeah," the crewman agreed, his tone serious now. "I get it. You know, it's not going to be easy. But that doesn't mean you have to do it alone. Sometimes facing things head-on is the only way through." Johann glanced out at the water, his chest tightening as the memories surged again. "It's hard," he said quietly. "It's like I can't escape it. Every time I close my eyes, I see those orcas. I hear them. It's like they're still out there, waiting." The crewman stood next to him, his gaze focused on the horizon. "That's normal. You've been through something. Well, it's not something most people would survive, but you did. And that means something. You're stronger than you think." Johann shook his head, the frustration bubbling to the surface. "You don't get it," he snapped, turning to face the crewman. "I don't want to be strong. I just want it to be over. I want to forget about it, but I can't. It's like the sea is always there, always watching." The crewman was quiet for a moment, then placed a hand on Johann's shoulder, his grip firm but not forceful. "The sea's not your enemy, Johann. It's not out to get you. The fear, that's the enemy. And until you face it, you're going to carry it around with you like a weight on your chest." Johann's breath caught in his throat as he looked down at the ground. The weight of the crewman's words pressed on him, but it was true. He had been running from it, trying to ignore the fear that had taken root in his heart. But it wasn't just the orcas. It wasn't just the ocean. It was himself, his own mind that had built this prison around him. "I'm not sure how to face it," Johann said, his voice smaller now, the anger slipping away. "I don't know if I can. What if it's too much?" The crewman gave him a sympathetic look. "Then we take it one step at a time, one moment at a time. I'm not asking you to dive back into the water and face the orcas head-on today. But you are standing here, aren't you? You're already facing it, just by being here. You're doing more than you think." Johann looked back at the ocean, his mind still spinning with the thoughts of the past weeks. Could he do this? Could he really face his fear, truly accept that the attack was behind him? The thought of it felt impossible, but standing here with the crewman beside him, he realized something. Maybe he didn't have to do it alone. Maybe it wasn't about fighting the fear. Maybe it was about learning to live with it. "I don't want to run anymore," Johann said quietly, his voice full of uncertainty but also determination. "I don't want to be afraid of the ocean. I don't want to be afraid of what's out there, but how do I stop being scared?" The crewman smiled gently, his expression filled with understanding. "You don't have to stop being scared. You just have to take that fear and learn how to live with it. It's part of you now, but it doesn't have to control you. Just like the sea. You can respect it without letting it rule your life." Johann nodded, feeling the first flicker of something hopeful in his chest. It wasn't a solution. Not yet. But it was a beginning. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely overwhelmed by the weight of his own fear. He still felt it, deep in his bones, a cold shadow that lingered at the edge of his thoughts. But maybe it wasn't as powerful as it had once been. "I think I understand," Johann said after a pause, his voice steadier than before. "Maybe I can do this. Maybe I can start by just being here, not running away, not hiding." The crewman clapped him on the back. "That's the spirit. One day at a time, Johann, one day at a time." For the first time since the attack, Johann didn't feel completely alone. He had someone beside him, someone who understood, who had seen the terror and still believed that he could overcome it. The sea still held its dangers, still held the memory of what had nearly killed him. But Johann realized that it was not just a place of fear. It was a place of strength, of survival, a place where he could reclaim a part of himself that had been lost. The waves lapped gently against the shore, and Johann's breath seemed to sync with the rhythm of the water. He wasn't sure how long it would take to heal, how long it would take to quiet the fear that still whispered in the back of his mind. But for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was on the right path, and that was enough for now. "Let's go for a walk," the crewman said, breaking the silence. "The day's just getting started." Johann smiled, feeling the weight of his thoughts shift, if only for a moment. He was ready to take the next step to face the fear and to live again. Johann sat in the small cafe by the water, his fingers tapping absent-mindedly on the table. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over everything. Outside, the world seemed calm, quiet, even. The water lapped gently against the dock, the boats bobbing lightly on the soft waves. But inside, Johann could feel the tension in his chest. It was like a weight, a constant pressure that never truly left him. He had been trying to find a sense of normality again. It wasn't easy. Every day felt like a struggle. Some days, better than others. But today it felt different. The fear that had clung to him like a shadow for so long was still there, of course. It didn't go away. But something had shifted. He wasn't running from it anymore. He was facing it. The crewman hadn't been around much these past few days. He had given Johann space, something he appreciated but also feared. He was left to face his demons alone, without the comfort of a familiar face, the strength of someone else's steady presence. Today, though, Johann had agreed to meet him again. It wasn't easy to admit, but he knew he needed someone who understood. Someone who knew what it was like to be out there, alone, in the vastness of the sea. Someone who wouldn't push him too hard, but would still challenge him to keep moving forward. Johann glanced at the door as it opened, and the familiar figure of the crewman entered. The man moved with ease, his presence calm and grounded like the anchor that kept everything steady when the storm was too much to handle. His eyes met Johann's, and for the first time in a long while, Johann felt something other than fear. "Hey," the crewman said, his voice warm. "How's it going?" Johann gave a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm here, aren't I? I guess that means I'm doing okay." The crewman raised an eyebrow as he sat down across from Johann, setting his cup of coffee down. "Just okay?" "I'd say that's progress." Johann chuckled dryly. "Progress is one step at a time. Some days it feels like I'm standing still." "I get it," the crewman replied. "It's not easy, but you're still here. That counts for something, right?" Johann nodded slowly, his fingers tracing the edge of his cup. "Yeah, I guess it does." He hesitated, his eyes drifting toward the window, watching the people walk by outside. "I don't know what's next. I mean, I survived. But I can't shake this feeling like I'm waiting for something to go wrong. Like I'm waiting for the next wave to come and knock me under." The crewman leaned back in his chair, his gaze soft. "That's natural. You've been through something that most people can't even imagine. But here's the thing. It's over. The Orcas aren't going to come back for you. The sea isn't your enemy anymore. What you're dealing with now is something else. Something you've got to face within yourself." Johann swallowed, his throat tightening. "I wish I could just let go of it. I wish I could forget the way the water felt. How everything felt like it was closing in. How I thought I was going to die out there." The crewman's expression softened even further, and he placed his hand gently on the table. "You don't have to forget it. You don't have to erase it, but you do have to learn how to live with it. You survived because you were strong enough to keep going. But that strength? It's not just in your body. It's in your mind, too. You're still here because you didn't let that fear swallow you whole. That's what matters." Johann let out a breath, trying to calm the swirling thoughts in his mind. He hadn't realized until now how much he had been holding on to the fear, how much it had shaped every part of his daily life. It wasn't just the memory of the attack that haunted him. It was the way it had altered how he saw the world, how he saw himself. He had been trying to pretend like everything was fine, but it wasn't. He couldn't just move on without confronting the damage that had been done. I don't know how to fix it, Johann said quietly. It's like, the ocean is always there, you know? It's just waiting. And every time I see the water, I feel like it could come for me again, like I'm just one bad wave away from being pulled under. The crewman took a long sip of his coffee before responding, his voice calm but firm. You're not going to find peace by running from the water. The ocean isn't the enemy, Johann. What you're afraid of is what's inside of you. The fear you've been carrying around. You're giving that fear too much power. Johann met his gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly. And how do I stop? How do I stop fearing something that nearly killed me? You stop by taking it one day at a time, the crewman said, leaning forward, his tone intense. You stop by deciding that you're not going to let the fear take over. You stop by remembering that you survived. The orcas, the sea. None of it matters if you let the fear win. You have to choose to live. Choose to face it instead of running from it. Johann's heart pounded as he processed the words. He had heard them before in different ways, but they had never truly clicked. Maybe because he hadn't believed it himself. Maybe because he hadn't realized just how much power the fear had over him. It wasn't just about the orcas anymore. It was about reclaiming control over his life, over his mind. It was about choosing to face what had happened instead of letting it keep him paralyzed. But how do I face it? Johann asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. How do I make the fear go away? How do I make it stop? The crewman looked at him for a long moment and then his gaze softened. You don't make it go away, Johann. It's always going to be there, in some way. It'll be in your thoughts, in your body, in your memories. But you can learn to live with it. You can learn to make peace with it. You don't need to fight it. You just need to accept that it's part of you, but it doesn't control you. Johann exhaled slowly, his thoughts swirling as the weight of the crewman's words began to sink in. Maybe he didn't need to fight the fear. Maybe for the first time he could stop trying to outrun it. He could learn to live with it, just as the crewman had said. It wasn't about erasing the memory, it was about moving forward despite it. I guess that's the hardest part, Johann murmured, looking down at his hands. Accepting it. Accepting that it's part of me now. The crewman nodded, his eyes full of understanding. Yeah, it's hard, but it's the only way to truly move on. The ocean taught you something, Johann. It taught you about your strength, about your survival, and it's time to let that strength guide you from here on out. Johann sat back in his chair, his mind racing as he thought about everything the crewman had said. He felt something shifting inside him. Like a wall he had built up for months was beginning to crack, slowly but surely. The fear was still there, but it didn't feel as suffocating anymore. He wasn't sure if it would ever completely disappear, but he wasn't as afraid of it as he had been before. He could breathe again. Maybe you're right, Johann said, his voice steady now. Maybe it's not about making it stop. Maybe it's about letting it be a part of me, but not letting it define me. The crewman smiled, and for the first time Johann saw the faintest hint of pride in his eyes. Exactly. You're learning. And that's what matters. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them lost in their own thoughts, before the crewman stood up, pushing his chair back. You coming back to the boat with me? The crewman asked, a smile tugging at his lips. There's always more to learn out there. Johann stood as well, a sense of calm settling over him. The fear wasn't gone, not by a long shot, but it wasn't controlling him anymore. It was just something he had to learn to live with. Yeah, Johann said, his voice steady. Let's go. As they left the cafe together, the sound of the ocean in the distance, Johann felt something shift inside him. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in months he felt ready to walk it. Johann stood at the edge of the dock, the wind pulling at his jacket, the faint spray of sea salt in the air. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the water as the sky above slowly turned from black to a deep shade of blue. He wasn't sure why he was here, why today felt different, or why he had agreed to meet the crewman on the boat. Maybe it was because the crewman had been right. Maybe it was because he knew he couldn't keep running from the water. The last few weeks had been a blur of trying to reclaim pieces of himself, but the memories of the orcas, of the attack, still haunted him. The fear had been relentless, gnawing at him in ways he hadn't been able to explain to anyone. But today felt different. Maybe it was the fact that he had stopped hiding from the water, or maybe it was the way he'd finally allowed himself to admit that the fear wasn't just something to fight. It was something to live with. He felt a familiar presence before. He heard the sound of boots approaching. The crewman had arrived as expected. His footsteps were steady, deliberate like always, and his voice, when it came, was as solid as the ground beneath them. "You ready?" the crewman asked, his tone light but with an underlying seriousness that Johann had come to respect. Johann turned, meeting the crewman's gaze. For a moment he didn't say anything. He just looked out at the water, taking a long breath, the scent of salt in the air. The waves were calm today, the sea almost peaceful, as though it was trying to offer him the comfort he hadn't been able to find in himself. "I don't know," Johann said, his voice rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. "I mean, I don't know if I'll ever be ready, but I'm here. That's something, right?" The crewman smiled, his eyes softening with understanding. "That's everything. You're here. That's all we can ask for." Johann nodded, glancing down at the boat, the small craft rocking gently in the water, waiting for them. The crewman didn't say anything else, and for a moment, they both just stood there in the silence, letting the sound of the waves fill the space between them. Finally, the crewman motioned toward the boat. "Let's get going. We've got a long way ahead of us." Johann followed him, climbing into the boat with careful, deliberate movements. His heart thudded in his chest, but he didn't let the fear show. Not yet. He had made it this far after all. He could face the water. He could face the fear. It wasn't about pretending it didn't exist. It was about understanding that it didn't have to control him. As the crewman started the engine, the hum of the motor filled the air. Johann felt the boat lurch forward, the sensation strangely grounding. The water stretched out before them, vast and unbroken. For the first time in what felt like forever, Johann didn't feel as though he was being swallowed by it. He didn't feel like the ocean was an enemy. Not today. The crewman glanced at him, his voice steady. "How's it feel?" Johann didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the words settle. "It's different," he said finally. "It's still there, though. The fear. It's like a shadow that follows me, but it's not as loud. It's not suffocating me anymore." The crewman nodded, his eyes ahead, focused on the path they were taking. "That's the thing about fear, Johann. It doesn't go away completely. It just stops being the thing that drives you. You learn to live with it, to respect it. You start to move through it instead of letting it hold you in place." Johann exhaled, feeling a strange kind of relief at the crewman's words. Maybe he was right. Maybe the fear wasn't something that could ever be completely gone. But the fact that he wasn't running from it anymore, that felt like progress. The boat sped through the water, cutting through the waves, and Johann felt his heart start to slow down. It was just him and the crewman now. The vast ocean, the same ocean that had nearly taken his life, stretched out before them. But this time, it didn't feel as dangerous. It wasn't an enemy. It was just a part of the world. And maybe, just maybe, he could start to understand it. As they moved farther from the shore, Johann's thoughts wandered to the memories, the flashes of the attack, the moments when he had truly thought he wouldn't make it. He could still hear the sound of the Orcas' clicks, the slapping of their tails against the water. He could still feel the terror that had gripped him, but it was different now. The memories weren't as sharp, not as vivid. They were still there, yes, but they no longer controlled him. "You think I'll ever be okay?" Johann asked suddenly, the question slipping out before he could stop it. The crewman turned slightly, his expression unreadable. "I think you're already more than okay, Johann. You're still here, and that's enough." Johann felt a wave of emotion flood over him. He didn't know what he expected from the crewman. Words of reassurance maybe, or something that would convince him that everything would be fine. But this wasn't about being fine. This was about understanding that he didn't have to be perfect. He didn't have to have everything figured out, he just had to keep moving forward. The boat continued to glide over the water, the hum of the engine steady and calming. The fear, the uncertainty, it was still there, but it didn't feel as all-consuming. It was as if the ocean had finally started to reveal itself, no longer a place of danger, but a place of understanding. Johann could see the beauty in it now, even in the moments of quiet stillness. He didn't have to conquer the water. He just had to learn to live with it. After a long silence, the crewman spoke again. "You know, you're not the only one who's afraid of the sea." Johann looked at him, surprised by the admission. "What do you mean?" The crewman's eyes softened and he let out a small, humorless laugh. "I've been on the water my whole life and I've seen some things that most people would never believe. But the truth is, the sea is unpredictable. It doesn't care about you. It's a force of nature. You can't control it. You can only respect it. And sometimes that's the hardest thing to accept." Johann nodded slowly, absorbing the words. It was true. The sea had no care for him or for anyone. It was an entity of its own, unpredictable and vast. But that wasn't something to fear. It was something to understand, to respect. The Orcas had shown him that much. They were part of the same world, a world that could be beautiful and terrifying at the same time. "I guess we're not so different," Johann said quietly. "Me and the ocean." The crewman turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "In a way, yeah. We're both unpredictable, and we both have our dangers, but we're also part of the same world. And once you stop fighting that, once you stop trying to control everything, you start to realize that you don't need to fear it. You just need to accept it." Johann thought about that for a long time, letting the words settle deep inside him. The fear wasn't gone, and it probably never would be. But it didn't have to define him. He didn't have to let it rule his life anymore. The boat slowed, and the crewman turned to look at him, his eyes steady. "You ready to go back?" Johann looked out at the water, the waves now seeming almost peaceful in the early morning light. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in weeks he felt a sense of peace inside him. He didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to be fearless. He just needed to keep moving forward. "Yeah," he said, quietly. "Let's go back." The crewman smiled and they turned the boat around, heading back toward the shore. The waves were still there, the water still vast. But Johann knew that he had found something he hadn't expected. Peace. In the quiet understanding that the fear, the water, and everything else would always be there. But they didn't have to control him. He could live with it. And that was enough.